Imagine coming home from work to find your disabled son stranded on the sidewalk, his wheelchair cut in half by a power saw, all because a bureaucrat with a clipboard decided your family doesn't fit the community image. That's exactly what happened to me after I'd put 40 years of hard work into Bailey Construction, buying my dream home. When this HOA president destroyed my 17-year-old son's wheelchair, she wasn't just attacking his property, she was attacking everything I had built and sacrificed for. What she didn't know, after 4 decades fighting corporate battles, I was about to teach her what happens when you mess with a man's family. Would you let someone with a rulebook destroy what you've worked your whole life to protect? My name is Robert Miller, 62 years old. After serving in the Marines for 6 years and spending 4 decades working my way up from apprentice to senior manager at Bailey Construction, I finally retired with enough savings to buy that perfect home I'd promised my late wife, Margaret. A family she didn't live to see, losing her battle with cancer 3 years ago, but I know she'd be proud of the place I found for me and our son. I moved to Oak Ridge Estates with my boy, Jason, who's just 17. Last year, Jason was in a hunting accident with my brother-in-law. Their truck rolled over in rough terrain, and Jason's spine was injured. He lost mobility from the waist down. That accident haunts me every day. A father is supposed to protect his son, you know? Now my focus is ensuring Jason has as normal a life as possible, just like I promised Margaret in her final days. Oak Ridge Estates seemed perfect. Good, solid construction, single-level homes, wide doorways, and most importantly, a quiet community where Jason could focus on his studies and healing. The property values were stable, and I thought my neighbors understood what it means to respect what a man builds for his family. Then everything changed when Carolyn Richards, 47, became HOA president last fall. She's one of those corporate executives who's never worked with her hands a day in her life, yet somehow thinks she knows better than those of us who actually built this country. Always dressed in those designer suits, hair perfectly styled, driving a Mercedes I suspect she's still making payments on. Within her first month, she doubled our HOA fees and started what she called community aesthetic enhancement, basically forcing everyone to conform to her idea of what a neighborhood should look like. I first met Carolyn at a community meeting where she laid out her vision for Oak Ridge. This community has tremendous, untapped potential, she said, looking down her nose at us. With proper standards and enforcement, we could see property values increase 30% within 2 years. She talked about our homes like they were investments, not places where families build memories. What she really meant became clear soon enough. Anyone who didn't fit her image of the ideal resident, especially retirees, veterans, and families with special needs, would be pressured until they left. She saw my son's disability as a community image issue, not as a young man's struggle for independence. She viewed my decades of hard-earned knowledge as outdated thinking rather than valuable experience. I'd spent 40 years earning my place, building something for my family. This woman thought she could tell me how to live in the home I'd purchased with a lifetime of honest work. I didn't know it then, but her war against what I'd built was just beginning. The problems began just 2 weeks after Carolyn took office. I'd spent a weekend modifying my garage to accommodate Jason's medical equipment. I did the work myself, all up to code, with proper permits from the county. I've built structures that could withstand hurricanes. I think I can handle a few shelves and a ramp in my own garage. But that Monday morning, there she was, standing on my driveway, uninvited, clipboard in hand, that fake smile plastered across her face. "Mr. Miller," she said with that condescending tone executives use when they think they're talking to someone beneath them, "I notice you've made unauthorized modifications to your property. Any changes require prior approval from the architectural committee." I showed her my permits and explained it was for Jason's physical therapy equipment and medical supplies. "This is for my son's independence, something I promised his mother I'd protect," I told her. "You know what," she said, "your personal problems aren't relevant to community standards, Mr. Miller. Rules apply to everyone." Personal problems? My son's mobility isn't a personal problem, it's his life. And she was questioning my competence on construction matters, me, who'd overseen projects worth millions while she was probably still in college. That was just the opening salvo in her campaign. Within days, I received a formal violation notice about my pickup truck. Non-luxury vehicles must be parked in garages or rear driveways only, it stated coldly. The truck I'd worked overtime to pay for, never missed a payment in 12 years, was suddenly detrimental to neighborhood aesthetics. Next came a citation for the American flag on my porch. My father served in Vietnam, I served in Desert Storm, and now Carolyn Richards declared our flag non-standard decor. When I called to challenge this disrespect to our service, her assistant dismissed me. Ms. Richards is too busy for individual concerns. By month 3, my HOA violation file was thicker than my property deed. Each new day brought new absurdities. Jason's therapy equipment labeled unsightly, the garden shed I'd built to professional standards deemed non-conforming, even my garbage cans visible for just minutes after collection earned me a $50 fine. Every notice arrived with the same threatening reminder about additional penalties or legal action. This wasn't enforcement, it was intimidation. Carolyn was sending a clear message: submit to her authority or be driven out. The other men in the neighborhood started sharing similar stories. Jim Harrison from down the street got fined because his lawnmower was visible through his garage window. Mike Johnson received a warning because his grandkid left bicycles in the driveway during their weekend visit. It became clear Carolyn wasn't protecting property values. She was systematically targeting certain residents, particularly older men who had worked hard all their lives and knew their rights. She wanted us replaced with younger, wealthier families who wouldn't question her authority. I faced bullies from the schoolyard to the boardroom. I thought those days were behind me, but at 62, I found myself once again having to defend what was rightfully mine. This time, though, it wasn't just about me, it was about my son's dignity and future. The situation escalated in April when Jason's physical therapist recommended he practice navigating different surfaces to build his upper body strength. Our porch had 3 steps, which made it impossible for him to enter and exit independently. So I designed a wheelchair ramp that would give my boy some freedom back. This wasn't some slap-together weekend project. I spent days drawing up plans, calculating the perfect incline angle, selecting pressure-treated lumber that would last decades. I've built ramps for commercial buildings that pass the strictest inspections. This one would be my finest work for the most important client I'd ever had. I took 3 days off to build it right. When I finished, that ramp was a thing of beauty, solid, level, with a gradual slope matching our home's trim exactly, with non-slip surfacing for safety during winter. Jason's face lit up when he first used it himself. "Dad, I can go outside whenever I want now," he said. That moment alone was worth every splinter and sore muscle. But our moment of victory lasted exactly 2 days. That Wednesday afternoon, Carolyn's black Mercedes pulled up, followed by the HOA maintenance truck. She marched up my driveway in her designer heels, with Frank, her so-called maintenance supervisor, trailing behind her like an obedient dog. Frank couldn't hammer a nail straight if his life depended on it. I'd seen his handiwork around the neighborhood. "Mr. Miller," Carolyn announced, not even bothering with a greeting. "That structure violates multiple HOA regulations and must be removed immediately." She thrust a paper at me, some official-looking violation notice with threatening language about daily fines. "This ramp is for my son's disability," I explained calmly, though my blood was already boiling. "It's protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act and county building codes." I showed her my approved permits and the contractor's license I'd maintained for 40 years. Carolyn barely glanced at the documents. "Your construction experience is irrelevant here, Mr. Miller. The Architectural Committee has processes and standards. This," she gestured dismissively at my craft work, "doesn't match the aesthetic guidelines for the community." My son's ability to enter his own home comes before your aesthetic guidelines, I replied, my voice steady but firm. She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. The rules aren't optional just because you find them inconvenient. You have 72 hours to remove the structure or face daily fines of $100. As they returned to their vehicles, I overheard Carolyn muttering to Frank, "These stubborn old men think their experience trumps our regulations. He needs to learn his place in our community hierarchy." Learn my place in a home I'd purchased with 4 decades of calloused hands and honest sweat? The insult cut deeper than any job site injury I'd ever suffered. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I found myself in my garage workshop, running my fingers over tools that had built schools, hospitals, and community centers across 3 states, tools that represented a lifetime of skill and knowledge, now dismissed as irrelevant by a committee of paper pushers who couldn't distinguish between a joist and a jam. The next morning, I called a lawyer friend from my construction days. "They can't legally force you to remove a necessary disability accommodation," he confirmed, "but they can make your life hell trying." He was right. The following week, every tiny detail on my property received scrutiny. The mailbox was apparently 2 inches too tall. The rose bushes Margaret had planted before she passed away were non-approved vegetation. Even the bird feeder Jason could watch from his bedroom window was suddenly a violation. It was clear this wasn't about rules or property values anymore. This was personal. Carolyn had decided to make an example of the man who dared to question her authority. But she'd picked the wrong man. I hadn't spent 4 decades in construction by backing down from challenges, and when it came to protecting my son's dignity, there was nothing I wouldn't face. What I didn't know was how far Carolyn would go to win this battle. May 18th. That date is burned into my memory like a brand. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unseasonably warm for spring. I had an appointment with my financial advisor to discuss Jason's college fund. Even with his disability, my boy was determined to study engineering next year. His mind works like nothing I've ever seen, always solving problems, figuring out better ways to do things. I'd left Jason at home. He'd insisted he'd be fine for 2 hours alone. "Dad, I'm 17, not 7, he'd said with that teenager eye roll I'd come to appreciate. It meant he was still a normal kid despite everything. He had physical therapy scheduled for 3 p.m. and planned to wheel himself to the end of our driveway to meet the therapist's van when it arrived. Jason used his everyday wheelchair in the house, lightweight, maneuverable, perfect for indoor use. But he kept his backup chair, a sturdier model for outdoor terrain, just inside the garage. That chair was custom-fitted with specialized cushioning to prevent pressure sores, reinforced wheels for rough surfaces, and adjustable settings for his specific measurements. $3,500 of specialized equipment that insurance had only partially covered. I'd paid the difference out of my retirement savings. Anything for my boy. My meeting ran long. Market fluctuations had affected my portfolio, and we were discussing options to ensure Jason's education would be fully funded. When I finally checked my phone, I had 3 missed calls from Jason and a text message that just said, "Dad, come home please." Something in a father's heart knows when his child is in trouble. I broke every speed limit getting back to Oak Ridge Estates. I found my son on our front lawn, his everyday chair tipped over on the grass, his face. My boy, who had faced his disability with such courage, was fighting back tears of humiliation. 3 neighbors stood nearby, looking horrified. And there on the concrete at the edge of our driveway was Jason's backup wheelchair, or what remained of it. The frame was cut clean through in multiple places. The wheels lay separated, the cushions slashed. Someone had systematically destroyed it with power tools. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside my son, checking him for injuries. "It was Mrs. Richards," he said, his voice shaking with anger and shame. I wheeled out to wait for Dr. Martinez. I left my backup chair near the sidewalk while I checked the mail. She drove up with Frank in the maintenance truck. She had a power saw. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Abernathy, stepped forward. "I saw it all from my window, Robert. It was horrible. That woman deliberately cut the wheelchair apart while your son begged her to stop. She said it was abandoned property in a restricted area. My security camera. I'd installed one after the ramp incident. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and accessed the footage. There it was in high definition. Carolyn Richards in her navy blue suit, pearl necklace gleaming in the sun, personally operating a circular saw while Frank held the chair steady. Sparks flew as she cut through the metal frame. Jason had wheeled himself toward them, pleading with them to stop. "This is a violation of setback requirements," she declared on camera, her voice clear over the saw's whine. "No personal items are permitted within 15 feet of sidewalks. We've warned you repeatedly about community standards." The camera caught my son's face as he watched his mobility being destroyed, the helplessness, the humiliation. But it also caught something else, something I almost missed the first time. As Carolyn finished and was packing up the saw, she turned to Frank and said, thinking she couldn't be heard, "Maybe now they'll understand who makes the rules around here." This wasn't enforcement. This was deliberate cruelty, a power play designed to break not just a wheelchair, but our spirits. I helped Jason back into his everyday chair, got him settled inside, and then stood alone in my garage, staring at the fragments of metal and upholstery that represented my son's independence. The rage I felt was something primal, something I hadn't experienced since my combat days. This woman had invaded my territory, damaged my property, and humiliated my son on the land I'd paid for with 4 decades of sweat and sacrifice. In that moment, standing among the ruins of my son's wheelchair, I made a decision. Carolyn Richards had just declared war on the wrong family. She thought she was dealing with a simple aging construction worker who would eventually bend to her will. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. That evening, as Jason and I were figuring out how he'd manage with just his indoor wheelchair, our doorbell rang. It was Jim Harrison from 3 doors down, a fellow Marine who'd served in Desert Storm like me. Behind him stood Mike Johnson, who runs his own plumbing business, and Tom Reeves, a retired high school shop teacher. "We heard what happened," Jim said, his face grim. "Got a minute to talk, brother?" In my living room, Jim didn't mince words. "That's not how we treat a man's family or property in this country," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Not in our neighborhood." Mike nodded, adding, "My cousin's in a wheelchair. Anyone touched his chair like that, there'd be hell to pay." Tom had brought a toolbox. "I can help reinforce your boy's everyday chair until you get a replacement, make it sturdier for outdoor use." "Us working men need to stick together against these paper-pushing tyrants," Mike said, clapping my shoulder. For the first time since moving to Oak Ridge, I realized I wasn't alone. Other men who understood the value of hard work, family, and respect were ready to stand with me. And that changed everything. The next morning, I drove to Carolyn's house on Oak Ridge Circle, the nicest street in the development. Her lawn was immaculate, maintained by the same landscaping company the HOA had contracts with. Funny coincidence. I rang her doorbell at exactly 8 a.m., professional courtesy, not too early to be rude, but early enough to show I meant business. When she opened the door, she was already dressed for her corporate job, designer coffee cup in hand. Her expression soured when she saw me standing there. "Mr. Miller," she said, not inviting me in. "If this is about yesterday's enforcement action, you can file a formal complaint with the HOA office." "Enforcement action?" I kept my voice level, the way my father taught me when addressing even those who don't deserve respect. "You destroyed my disabled son's medical equipment on my property. Your son's wheelchair was placed in a restricted area. You've received multiple warnings about personal items and setback zones." She spoke like she was reading from a script. "The board has been more than patient with your continued violations." That personal item was my son's mobility, his freedom, his dignity. I handed her a folder containing the security camera footage printed on photo paper. "I'm giving you one chance to make this right. Replace the wheelchair, apologize to my son, then we can put this behind us." She barely glanced at the photos. Mr. Miller, perhaps you don't understand how things work here. The line is wherever the HOA says it is. Your old-fashioned ideas about property rights simply don't apply in Oak Ridge Estates. I know my legal rights, I replied. Destruction of private property, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, harassment. Carolyn actually laughed. I have the entire board eating from my hand, and our legal fund is substantial. How long can a retiree on a fixed income afford to fight? Her voice dripped with condescension. She thought I was just another old man she could bully into submission. As I turned to leave, she added, if you continue making trouble, Mr. Miller, the violations will only increase. Some residents simply aren't a good fit for Oak Ridge. Perhaps you should consider selling before your property values are affected. Driving home, her words echoed in my mind.